Welcome to this video. We will cover the types of objects in Python. In Python, everything are represented as objects. So there are many different types of objects in Python. The most common and important object types are strings, integers, and floats. Anytime we can write words or uh, sequence of characters or text in Python, we are using a character string or a strings for short. The most common numbers, on the other hand, are represented by integers, and floating points also represent real numbers. For example, 3.14 minus 40.0. The 3.14 is a real number, so we can represent a real number using float object, float type object. So words or texts can be represented as strings in Python. Numbers can be represented by either integer or float. So float represents real numbers, and integer represents integer number. For example, the following code cells contains an integer number, int, integer number 11 is an integer. The floating point representation of these, for example, 1.14. 1.14 is a floating point representation. So this number is float type object. We also represent a string, this hello Python. This is an integer, a string representation. So this is a sequence of characters, words, or texts. So a sequence of characters, words, or texts can be represented as a string object in Python. We can also get the type of expression or the type of data using a built-in function is called type. Which type of data we wanted to store in a variable or store in memory. Python also refers to integers as int, floats as float, and character strings as str. So we can get the type of 12. 12 is an integer type, so we can get this type of number. So this by calling the function type and specifying the data inside the type, so we can return the type of that number. We can also get the type of float number. This 1.14 is a floating or float type. Type of string hello world Python. So this type of is represented as str, a string type. In the code below, use the type function to check the object type of 12 type 12.0. This is what a float representation, real number representation. Integers can be any number greater than or less than 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to n, and minus 1, minus 2, 3, up to minus n. So those are integers, integer numbers. We can represent those types using int object type. We can verify this is the case by using type function. We can print the type of -1. Which type of object is this? It is integer object. We can also check or print the type of number 4. This also integer. The type of 0, there is also integer object, integer object representation. The other important object type in Python is floats. Floats can be represented real numbers. They are a superset of integer numbers, but also include numbers with decimal points, decimal numbers. There are some limitations when you come to machine representation, representing real numbers, but floating point represent a good representation in real numbers in computer or machine. So we can represent real numbers using float. We can also learn more about the specific floats for your runtime environment by checking sys system.float_info. This will also tell us what's the largest and smallest numbers that can be represented with them. So the maximum and the minimum, or the largest and the smallest numbers, we can represent using float. So once I get the test sum, first we just import sys system, then we can call sys float info to learn more about the real number representation of floating point. Maximum number representation is these numbers plus 308, maximum expression 1024, maximum 10-digit expression 308. The minimum or the smallest numbers we can represent using Python floating object is this one, just minus 308, but the largest is plus 308. So this is the maximum or the largest and smallest numbers we can represent using float in machine computer memory. The type of 1.0 is float. We notice that 1 is an integer, but 1.0 is a float. So this can be represented floating object. The other is what type of 0.5. 0.5 is also a floating object, float object. Type of type of 0.56. This is also a float object. The other important thing in Python is what we can convert from one object type or from one data type to another or different object types. So we can change the type of an object in Python using cast mechanism. I think you know about casting in other programming language. So we can cast the type of the object to convert from one object to another object. For instance, we can convert an integer into a float. For example, 2 is an integer. We can convert to 2.0. This is a float by casting float. So first we verify the type of 2. This is an integer object. Now we can convert this integer number into float by casting float and that number. So this is what a floating object representation. So we can convert from integer into floating point. The other is convert integer 2 to a floating and check its type. Type, then float 2. This is what a floating type, but the number 2 is what integer, so we can convert into floating point and check the types of that number. When we convert an integer into a float, we don't really change the value, exact value, that is the significant number. However, we cast a float into an integer, we would potentially lose some information. When you convert integer number into floating, floating number into integer, we lose some information. We lose the number after decimal. That is what important thing. So we always consider that. So for instance, we cast the float 1.1 to integer, we get only 1. We just lose after point. That is 0.1 will be lost. So load the decimal information like for example int, this one only we get 1, so we lose the decimal numbers after decimal number. Converting from its strings to integers or floatings, so sometimes we can have a string that contains number. We may have a string that contain a number within it. So if this is the case, we can cast that string that represents a number into an integer using int function. So for example, this is a string, but that contains integer number or a number, not only integer, it may be floating point, but we can convert this into integer by casting integer. This is what conversion from a string into an integer. This is. But when we try to do sum with a string that is not a perfect match for a number, it may be contain characters including number, so we will get an error. We cannot convert a string which contains a character into any integer or floating point. For instance, 1 or 2, 1 and 2 is a number, but it contains a character or people. These are characters, so we cannot convert into an integer. It will generate an error. Let's try. So value error. The value error invalid literal for integer. So we cannot convert other than numbers from a string to integer. Only convert a string contain number only, or no that matches for a number. We can also convert the strings contain floating point, just like this. This is a floating point into float. So we can convert floating or numbers, integer numbers, strings which contains which matches a string or floating or integer numbers. Note that a string can be represented with a single quotes or double quotes, but you cannot mix both. Either both single and when you start open with single quote, you should have to enclose by single quote. So for instance, let's try hello. This is beginning with single quote, but ended by double quote. So this generates an error. Int EOL while scanning string literals, end of literal. So this is an error. So when you begin with a single quote, we should have to end it by a single quote. So we can enclose by single quote or double quotes in a string. The other is converting numbers to string. We can also convert convert numbers to strings, just like converting from string to number. So we can convert strings to numbers. It's also only natural to assume that we can convert numbers to string, right? So for example, str, just call str2 is integer, and the casting type is a string, so we can convert into a string. So it encloses by single quote or any quotation. So this is what a string representation, always enclosed by single or double quote. It is what representing string, not integer, not a floating point. And there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to make floats into strings as well. Here we can convert a string floating point into strings as well. So conversion is important to especially to specify the type of data, especially when you accept user input. When you enter two, then you should have to convert that type into integers. What you wanted to perform any calculation or mathematical expression. So we'll see in next video. The other important data type in Python is Boolean. Boolean is another important type in Python. So an object of type Boolean can take one of the two values, either true or false. So Boolean can be represented by true or false. Notice that the value true has an uppercase of T. If the value is true, we always write the first letter in uppercase. Uppercase. The same is true for false value. So we must use the uppercase F. So this is false value, Boolean representation, false value. When you ask Python to display the type of Boolean, use bool, then the value true. I mean type, not type, bool. This is a Boolean value, the type of true or false. The false is also, that is Boolean. We can cast Boolean objects to other data types. We can also do conversion from Boolean to other data types. We can cast Boolean with value true to another integer or floating. We will get a 1. The number representation of true and false is 0 and 1. I mean true 1, 0 is false. So we can convert, for example, int true. It will display what? 1. 1 is what? True in Boolean. False also represents 0. Int false, that is what? 0. We can convert Boolean Boolean into other data type. We can convert 1 to Boolean. For example, bool 1. 1 is what? Integer, but we can convert into that represents true. The same is true for 0. 0. It convert into false. We can also convert true to false by casting float true two floats by casting floats. They are 1.0. The same. So these are the topics we have covered. So you can do these exercises by your own by yourself. So what is the data type of the result of this expression? You can write your code below. Don't forget to run your code to see the output of this code. And also check the solution by double click. You can also check the expression, the type of this expression by writing your code below. So don't forget to write to run your code to see the output. So this is all about types of objects in Python, and we can also convert from one type to other types. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.